Could have been something out of a John le Carré novel, but this horror is all very real. A clandestine group turned to old-school beepers, those devices used by doctors and others before the advent of cell phones, to safely, they thought, communicate. But somehow, the other side infiltrated these devices during their manufacturing halfway across the world, and then on a well-planned day, hundreds of beepers sent a false message from what they believed was leadership, and when these hundreds of members went to read the messages, they exploded. Yes, hundreds of beepers did explode across Lebanon simultaneously. The result was thousands being injured, including many innocent civilians who just happened to be standing nearby. The most recent casualty count is at 12, but expected to go higher, perhaps significantly higher. Hands were blown off, faces were mangled, sirens and chaos. That was Lebanon yesterday, the target being Hezbollah.
According to news reports, Israel has confided in its ally Washington that it was their actual handiwork. No one doubts that, as Israel's intel prowess and execution is legendary, but now as the dust settles, many wonder if this really will be the beginning of a wider war in the region. Let's remember, Israel and Hamas have been at war for almost a year now. There have been missiles fired between Hezbollah in Lebanon and Israel in the last few months. The Houthis in Yemen have also been active. So here to further explain what this latest attack means is Professor Trita Parsi, Executive Vice President of the Quincy Institute of Statecraft. Dr. Parsi, thank you so much for joining us. I wonder if you could take us into some of the conversations that are likely happening in Beirut right now as a result. Of course, Iran's ambassador to Beirut was harmed in this attack. I think we're reading and hearing more about his injuries being very significant. But what do you think is going to be the response in the short term coming from Beirut?
So if you take a look at this over the course of the last 11 months, the pattern we see is that the overwhelming number of attacks are coming from the Israeli side against Lebanon. Up until about a month ago, the statistics show that 83% of all of the projectiles being fired were fired from the Israeli side into Lebanon, not the other way around. And this then supports another pattern that has also been quite clear, which is that it is not Hezbollah or Iran that is looking for a fight or an expansion of the war. It is on the Israeli side. In fact, the Israeli defense minister just said earlier this week that war with Lebanon is necessary in order to what he called tranquilize the northern front. And we also have statements from the U.S. government, or at least leaks from the U.S. government, saying that for months they have tried to convince the Israelis not to start another war, not to expand the war into Lebanon. The Lebanese have not responded in the same manner or with the same ferociousness, and that has been criticized by some on their end as saying that it's not been enough to restore deterrence. And the Iranians have not at all responded in some cases, including the assassination of Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran on the day of the inauguration of the Iranian president. So the question here at this point is, you know, the Israelis seem to be quite intent on expanding this war, really getting into a real war with Lebanon. And the more we're seeing that Hezbollah is showing a degree of restraint, not full restraint, but a degree of restraint, it does not seem to lead to a scenario in which the Israelis are backing off, but on the contrary, they're further escalating. And this is in contradiction to what the U.S. is telling the Israelis that it wants Israel to do, which is to not start a war, certainly not right before the elections.
I want to step back.
From the U.S. standpoint, sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead, finish your point.
Well, I was just going to say, from the U.S. standpoint, obviously, the most important thing here is to not have a regional war that drags the U.S. into it. But unfortunately, that is exactly what the Israelis seem to be intent on doing. And Biden's strategy of preventing that has been an absolutely abysmal failure.
Can we talk a little bit more about what actually took place yesterday? You know, these videos all over social media of the pagers exploding, injuring, you know, not just the people who had them, but people nearby. I mean, can you imagine if this happened while you were driving? That the potential to harm not specifically alleged Hezbollah fighters is, I'm sure we're going to continue to learn about all the examples of that happening. I mean, this is kind of Black Mirror dystopia, kind of your device just exploding in your pocket. What do we know about how this operation was executed? Is this going to be a new front just in warfare more generally? Do you have to worry about, where, what hostile nation your cell phone came from, the technology used to do this? I presume, my understanding is it wasn't like some hacking of the pager technology, but rather that they had something in them already, that you can't just technologically, do this to any random device of this kind. But what do we know about how this was done and what it means for the future of warfare?
We don't have a full picture, but let me start off by saying this. If some other entity had done this to Israel or to the United States, we would have immediately called it an act of terror and an act of war. Now we're doing neither. But in the eyes of much of the world, that is exactly what this is. Now, when it comes to the details of exactly what happened, the picture is still not fully clear. But it does appear very likely that these were beepers that the Israelis had interjected on their way to Lebanon in a third country, injected a specific type of explosive in it, up to 20 grams of it. And this was done about 4 to 5 months ago. And then the question is, how exactly did they manage to make them detonate all at the same time? Is it as a result of sending signals to the beepers that overheated the battery and then that caused the explosion to take place? Earlier on, there was some speculation that that was what was done, but without explosives being inside the beepers, and as a result, this could be done to any beeper. It does not appear to be the case at this point. The structure of the explosions, etc., do not seem to suggest that that is a battery exploding, and certainly not a battery exploding with this type of ferocity of being able to kill people. So there seems to have been a combination of the two. But as you pointed out, the Israelis had no idea where this very large number of beepers were at the time in which the explosions took place. People could be driving. In some cases, they were in hospitals. In some cases, hospital personnel were holding these beepers in hospitals, causing damage inside those hospitals as well. And again, that is precisely why, if this had been done to us, there would have been absolutely no hesitation. We would have called this an act of terror, because by definition, we do not have any control over the degree to which civilians would have been targeted and harmed in this.
Dr. Parsi, I wonder if you could speak to the timing of this attack. I'll note that Secretary of State Blinken is actually in Cairo at this very moment working on a ceasefire deal on behalf of the administration. What went into the timing of this specific attack by Israel?
I mean, the timing we have seen on many of these other attacks by the Israelis is that they either don't care at all what the U.S. is doing in terms of these ceasefire talks that at this point are quite farcical, or that they're actually doing it at a moment in order to sabotage those talks, not that those talks were going anywhere anyways. But I think what is increasingly clear, though, is that there seems to be a desire on the Netanyahu government to expand the war and to expand the war prior to the U.S. election. This would have the benefit for Netanyahu's perspective of most likely helping Trump get elected. That seems to be the calculation, whether that's true or not. It would force both Trump and Harris to take on this knee-jerk pro-Israel position, even though what Israel is doing is completely undermining U.S. interests. And then by the time either Harris or Trump gets into office, the war is already a reality. And as a result, the U.S.'s maneuverability in the region will be even less. And there's little that they can do about it. Again, none of this would have happened, in my view, had it not been for the Biden administration adopting this so-called bear hug strategy with Israel in the first place. This idea that the best way to exert leverage and gain leverage over Israel in order to be able to restrain it is to actually support it to the tilt, defend it and protect it at the UN, make excuses for it when it is assassinating American citizens. And that some way, somehow, miraculously would cause the Israelis to listen more to the United States. It's been completely the opposite, predictably. There's absolutely no reason to believe that that strategy would have worked in the first place. And instead, what we have seen is that the more the Biden administration has done this, the more they have protected Israel, made excuses for Israel, armed Israel to the tilt, the more Israel has become dismissive of American wishes.
And lastly, how would you respond to an argument I saw on social media from supporters of Israel saying that, well, their state of war exists between Israel and Hezbollah? This was it's not a surprise that they're enemy groups, that Hezbollah is a terrorist group, and so this was a legitimate attack on their operating capabilities.
Well, first of all, even if one were to accept the argument that a war is already existing between Israel and Hezbollah, reality is that this was a significant escalatory move that would bring the war very likely bring it into a much higher level. And again, I'm speaking from a U.S. national interest perspective. That's exactly what we want to avoid, because if this war escalates further, then it risks dragging the United States into it. And the absolute last thing we need is another war in the Middle East that the U.S. is involved in, particularly one that absolutely serves none of our interests. Secondly, even if the Israelis were to make the argument that they're targeting Hezbollah and they view it as a terrorist organization, et cetera, this was not a targeted attack. This was something that, as you mentioned, could happen when they're driving a car, causing massive car accidents. At the end of the day, we have about 4,000 people injured, 300 critically at the hospitals. Not all of them in any way, shape, or form were Hezbollah operatives. And again, had Hezbollah or any other entity done it to Israel or to the United States, we would not have hesitated. We would have called it an act of war, and we would have called it an act of terrorism.
Trita Parsi, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me.